I built the family empire from scratch. This statement may sound exaggerated, but it's the absolute truth. My name is Audrey Blackwell, and the story of Blackwell Enterprises didn't begin with my father, as corporate legend suggests. It truly started with me on a rainy September afternoon, holding a mop while cleaning the fogged-up window of the small furniture shop my father ran in Portland. Howard Blackwell had a modest space on the corner of Burnside and 23rd Avenue, a furniture store selling mid-quality sofas to middle-class families. It wasn't bad. It wasn't extraordinary. It was just enough. But I always knew it could be more. "Audrey, sweetheart, don't forget to clean behind the counter before closing," my father would say as he put on his coat. On Fridays, he left early for his poker nights with friends, leaving me at 16 in charge of closing the store. "Of course, Dad," I replied automatically, watching through the window as he crossed the street. Once he was out of sight, I set the mop aside, opened the hidden drawer under the register, and pulled out my notebook. That was where I designed the future. While other teenagers dreamed of parties and dates, I filled pages with business plans, profit margins, and expansion projections. My math homework often involved calculating how much capital we'd need to open a second store or the return on investment if we expanded our product line to include high-end home decor. At that age, I never shared these ideas with my father. Howard was a good man, but extremely cautious, the kind of businessman who preferred modest stability over the risk of something greater. And he never hid his expectation that eventually, my younger brother, Ethan, would take over the Blackwell empire, a single store that barely managed to support our family. "Blackwell men have always run the family business," he often said, as if 7 years of operating a single furniture shop constituted some kind of dynasty. Ethan was only 9 at the time, more interested in toys than financial statements. Yet, my father was already taking him to important meetings with suppliers, leaving me behind to clean windows and assist customers. I never truly resented it. While Ethan received superficial lessons about the business world, I absorbed the practical knowledge that only comes from hands-on experience. Every customer interaction, every negotiation with delivery drivers, every product complaint, each one became a lesson that shaped my deep instinctive understanding of retail. 8 years later, I returned to my father's store with a business administration degree from the University of Pennsylvania, an achievement that cost me partial scholarships, 3 simultaneous jobs, and countless sleepless nights. Meanwhile, Ethan was in his second year at a state university, more dedicated to fraternity parties than his studies. "Dad, we need to talk," I said on my first day back, placing a thick folder on his desk. Howard barely looked up from the receipts he was reviewing. "About what, sweetheart?" "About the future of Blackwell Furniture." That got his attention. "What do you mean? We're fine. Last quarter's numbers show stagnation," I interrupted, opening the folder. "Over the past 5 years, our average annual growth has been just 2.3%. Adjusting for inflation, we're practically standing still. Meanwhile, Portland's real estate market is booming, meaning more people are buying furniture." My father blinked, surprised by my analysis. "How do you know?" "Because I checked the books every night after you left. Because I spent 4 years studying exactly how to turn a stagnant business into something extraordinary." I took a deep breath. "Dad, we need to expand. We need to open a second store." Howard chuckled, not cruelly, but with that paternal condescension that reduced my ambitions to childish dreams. "Audrey, running one store is already enough work. When Ethan graduates and joins the business, maybe we can consider—" "Ethan doesn't care about this business," I said with the bluntness that always defined our relationship. "And we can't afford to wait 2 more years for him to figure that out." My father's expression hardened. "Your brother just needs time to mature." "The market isn't going to wait for him to mature, Dad." I turned a page in my presentation. "I've already identified a perfect location in Seattle. The market there is growing even faster than in Portland, but none of the major furniture chains have established a significant presence. If we act now, we can be the first. Seattle? He shook his head. "That's another state, Audrey. How would we manage a store so far away?" "I would manage it," I replied simply. "I'd spend half the week there, half here, until we establish a reliable team. I've already put together a complete business plan, including financial projections for the first 3 years. I slid a document toward him. My father picked it up skeptically, but as his eyes scanned the numbers, I saw something shift in his expression. Howard Blackwell could be cautious, but he wasn't stupid. And numbers, well, numbers didn't lie. How? Would we finance this? He finally asked. I smiled, knowing I had his attention. I have 3 different options here. The most conservative involves a small business loan using this store as collateral. It took 6 months of constant persuasion, but I finally did it. Blackwell Furniture's first expansion happened in Seattle, in a modest but well-located retail space near a developing neighborhood full of young professionals buying their first homes. The first few months were brutal. I constantly traveled between Portland and Seattle, sleeping in the back office of the new store 3 nights a week. I personally hired every employee, trained every salesperson, and arranged every display. My father remained in Portland, convinced that expansion was, at best, a risky venture that might pay off in the long run. I proved him wrong in exactly 73 days, the time it took for the Seattle store to surpass the daily revenue of the original Portland location. It's just a different market, my father tried to justify when I showed him the numbers. Seattle is bigger, wealthier. Exactly, I replied. And Boise could be too. His eyes widened. Boise? Idaho? Audrey? We're barely managing 2 stores. Actually, we're managing them very well, I gently corrected. And if we implement the computerized inventory system I've been proposing, we could handle 5 stores with the same administrative team. Howard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Your mother always said you had my stubbornness, and her ambition multiplied by 10. I smiled, feeling a tightness in my chest as I thought of my mother, who had passed away 7 years ago. She'd be proud of what we're building, don't you think? That was the first time I strategically used we, allowing my father to feel like he was still in control of something that, in reality, I had already been running on my own. By the time Ethan finally graduated and returned to Portland 2 years later, Blackwell Furniture had become Blackwell Home Furnishings, with 5 stores spread across the Pacific Northwest. I had convinced my father to expand our product line to include not just furniture, but also decor, high-quality housewares, and home textiles. Wow, Dad really expanded the business, Ethan commented on his first day back as I showed him our newly opened headquarters in Portland, a space 3 times larger than the original store, which now served only as a showroom. Actually, it was... I started to correct him, but my father cut me off. It was a family initiative, Howard said, placing his arm around Ethan's shoulders. And now that you're here, we can finally start planning for real growth. I bit my lip to hold back the response I wanted to give. The real growth had already been happening for 2 years, under my leadership. But to Howard, the return of the prodigal son marked the true beginning of the company's future. Ethan will be our new director of business development, my father announced at that week's general meeting. A position created just for my brother, with no prior experience or industry knowledge. I watched the faces of the regional managers I had personally hired and trained. I saw the confusion in their eyes, the silent question. Who is this newcomer, and why is he above us in the hierarchy? But I said nothing. Instead, I kept doing what I had always done, working tirelessly behind the scenes, fixing the mistakes Ethan would inevitably make, expanding our operations despite my father's hesitations. It was during our 6th year of expansion that an opportunity arose that truly changed everything. Westfield Furnishings, our biggest regional competitor, was struggling financially after a poorly planned expansion. The owner, an elderly man named Gerald Westfield, was approaching retirement with no successors interested in the business. We need to acquire Westfield, I declared during a strategic meeting with my father and Ethan. My brother, now 28 and already sporting the beginnings of a beer belly, laughed. Are you crazy? They have 15 stores. They're 3 times our size. They were 3 times our size, I corrected. Now they're on the verge of bankruptcy, with premium store locations that would take us years to acquire organically. We can buy them for a fraction of the actual value of their assets. Howard looked uneasy. The last thing we need is to take on a failing company, Audrey. We're not taking on a company, I explained patiently. We're acquiring undervalued assets, commercial properties, inventory, equipment, and most importantly, an established customer base. I've analyzed their operations. The problem isn't the individual stores, which are still profitable. The problem is their over-leveraged expansion financing. I spent the next 3 days practically camping out in my father's office, presenting detailed analyses, financial projections, and integration plans. Ethan would occasionally drop in, usually to express skepticism before heading off to long lunches with his friends. "We don't have the capital for this," my father finally insisted, looking exhausted from my persistence. "I have 4 investors, willing to come in as minority partners," I replied, not revealing the dozens of slammed doors I had faced to get those 4 yeses. Together, they would provide 60% of the necessary capital. We can finance the rest with a loan using our existing stores as collateral. Howard studied me for a long moment. "You really believe in this, don't you?" "This is the defining moment, Dad," I answered with the absolute conviction I always felt in crucial moments. 5 years from now, we'll look back and say, this is how we became national leaders, or this is how we lost our chance. Finally, reluctantly, he agreed. Acquiring Westfield Furnishings transformed us overnight. From a small regional chain, with 7 stores, we expanded to 22 locations across 5 states. Our revenue tripled in a single quarter. More importantly, we gained credibility in the market. Suddenly, suppliers who had previously treated us as secondary players were eager to do business with us. To formalize our new scale, we rebranded the company as Blackwell Enterprises, Inc. And it was at that moment that I made a decision that would change everything in the years to come. As we structured the newly expanded company, I designed a corporate framework that no one, not even my father, fully understood. Each operational region was set up as a separate LLC, with 49% of the shares owned by Blackwell Enterprises and 51% by a holding company called Phoenix Holdings, which I solely owned. Its incorporation documents were stored in a bank vault, not in the family company's records. On the surface, everything appeared as expected. Blackwell Enterprises was the parent company of our family's retail operations. But in reality, I had quietly secured operational control over most of the empire I was building. I didn't do it out of greed or some Machiavellian plan to seize control. I did it because, during the Westfield acquisition, I saw for the first time how fragile everything I had built truly was. I saw how my father and Ethan, with their combined recklessness, one overly cautious, the other dangerously impulsive, could dismantle years of work with a few poorly thought-out decisions. Phoenix Holdings was my insurance, my guarantee that the empire I was building from the ground up wouldn't be destroyed by those who didn't truly understand its value. Little did I know at the time that 15 years later, this quietly kept secret would become my only protection against my father's ultimate betrayal. In the years following the acquisition of Westfield, our expansion was meteoric. We went from 22 stores to 50, then 100, and eventually reached 230 locations spread across 28 states. Blackwell Enterprises was no longer a regional chain. It had become a nationally recognized name in the home furniture and decor industry. Every new store, every distribution center, every successful marketing campaign carried my invisible signature. While my father remained the nominal CEO, and Ethan flaunted his grand yet vague title of Director of Business Development, I held the seemingly less glamorous position of President of Operations, a role that, in practice, gave me control over every significant aspect of the company. "You should take more credit," Vanessa Hartley insisted during one of our late-night office dinners. 20 years of friendship and 15 as Blackwell's corporate attorney had made her my closest confidant, though even she didn't know the secret of Phoenix Holdings. "I'm not interested in credit," I replied, reviewing contracts as we ate Thai food. "I'm interested in results." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "That sounds noble, but we both know it's frustrating to watch your brother appear in every business magazine as the genius behind Blackwell's rise, when he can barely comprehend a quarterly report." She wasn't wrong. It was irritating to see Ethan on magazine covers and at industry conferences, talking about strategic vision and disruptive leadership, while I cleaned up his mistakes behind the scenes. But I had learned to stifle my pride a long time ago. What matters is that the banks, suppliers, and regional directors know who really makes the decisions, I said. When Ethan needs approval for one of his extravagant projects, who does he come to? You, Vanessa admitted. But still, you sacrificed everything for this company, Audrey. Your youth, relationships, even the chance to have children. The comment hit a raw nerve. At 55, I had unconsciously crossed the line where biological motherhood was still an option while building an empire. Not that I had time for lasting relationships. My 3-year marriage to Jonathan had ended over a decade ago, when he finally grew tired of playing second to my career. I made my choices, I replied, more curtly than I intended. And I don't regret them. Most of the time, that was true. Blackwell. Enterprises was my creation, my legacy. In private moments, I allowed myself to feel the pride I publicly denied. That deep sense of satisfaction when walking through our 28-story headquarters in Portland, visiting one of our stores and seeing customers take home products I had personally selected, or reviewing financial reports showing record-breaking profits year after year. Meanwhile, Ethan lived the life I had sacrificed. He married Caroline, the daughter of an influential banking family, in an extravagant ceremony that cost more than our first store acquisition in Seattle. They had 3 picture-perfect children for the company's Christmas cards, 2 boys, and a girl, all with their father's rehearsed smile. His office was twice the size of mine, with a panoramic view of the Willamette River, and furnished with Italian designer pieces we would never sell in our stores. Far too expensive for our target customers. We have to maintain appearances, Audrey, my father explained when I questioned the cost of the executive floor renovations. The Blackwells are public figures now. That was another constant frustration, the plural. The Blackwells invariably meant Howard and Ethan. At corporate events, in press features, and at key meetings, I was often introduced as our operations expert, as if I were just another hired executive rather than part of the family that gave the company its name. By the time I turned 50, the company employed over 3,500 people. Our annual revenue had surpassed $1.2 billion. My innovations in supply chain management had driven our profit margins to levels our competitors could only dream of. We launched an exclusive product line, Blackwell Signature, which quickly became our most lucrative revenue stream. That same year, during my traditional 1-week vacation, the only time off I took annually, Ethan nearly destroyed everything. Without consulting me, he approved a $40 million investment in a chain of ultra-modern furniture stores catering exclusively to the luxury market. We need to diversify into the premium segment, he insisted when I returned and discovered the acquisition was already in motion. This is not our market, I argued during a tense meeting with the board. Our strength lies in offering affordable quality to the middle class. This acquisition dilutes our brand and diverts capital we should be using to strengthen our position in the segment we dominate. Howard, already showing signs of age at 73, looked confused. But I thought you always advocated for expansion, Audrey. Strategic. Expansion, I corrected. Not impulsive acquisitions in markets we don't understand. If we were to enter the luxury segment, we would need to build organically, not buy a failing chain at an inflated price. Ethan, as always, resorted to his only truly effective argument. Dad approved the project, Audrey. It's already done. I spent the next 18 months working nearly 100-hour weeks to integrate the disastrous acquisition and minimize the damage. Eventually, we managed to sell most of the luxury stores, keeping only 3 in key metropolitan areas that we made marginally profitable after a complete restructuring. The company lost $28 million in the process. To the outside world, however, it was just another example of Blackwell's bold entrepreneurial instinct. At the annual shareholders meeting, Howard proudly announced how we overcame challenges and adapted our strategy, without mentioning that the challenge was created by the reckless son and overcome by the invisible daughter. It was after this episode that I met Jennifer Miles. Fresh out of her MBA at Stanford, she applied for our junior financial analyst position. Her resume was impressive, but it was her unsolicited analysis of the fundamental flaws in our recent luxury acquisition that caught my attention. Miss Blackwell, she said during the interview, I hope I'm not being impertinent, but I studied Blackwell Enterprises' trajectory as part of my final project in corporate strategy. Your acquisition of Elite Home Gallery seems to contradict every growth principle that built your previous success. Instead of being offended, I was intrigued by her honesty. And what principles would those be, Miss Miles? Expanding within. Your core market. Leveraging economies of scale. Maintaining a consistent value proposition. Sustainable growth versus disruptive moves. For a moment, I felt like I was looking at a younger version of myself, someone who saw beyond appearances and understood the real fundamentals that sustained the business. I hired her on the spot, not for the junior analyst position, but as my direct assistant. In the years that followed, Jennifer became my protégé, the first person I truly invested in to carry forward my vision. She absorbed knowledge at an impressive speed and, more importantly, shared my instinctive understanding of what made Blackwell Enterprises successful. "You see something special in her," commented Martin Chen, our CFO and one of the few trusted allies I had cultivated over the years. "I see my eventual successor," I responded bluntly. "Someone needs to protect this company when I'm no longer here." Martin, always cautious, glanced around before speaking. "Your father is almost 80, Audrey. Don't you think it's finally time to—" He left the sentence unfinished, but I understood his implication. Howard was aging. Eventually, the question of succession would have to be formally addressed. Martin, like many in the company, assumed that my years of dedication would finally be recognized. I shook my head. "You don't know my father like I do, Martin. To him, there is only one heir to the Blackwell throne, and it's not me." "But that's absurd," Martin protested. "Everyone in this company knows who really built all of this, who really makes the decisions." "Knowing and formally recognizing are two different things," I replied. "Besides, I didn't build this empire for titles or recognition. I didn't tell him the whole truth, that many years ago I had prepared for this inevitable moment when Howard would finally, formally hand over the reins to Ethan. Phoenix Holdings remained my best-kept secret, my contingency plan for the day I would need to protect everything I built from my own brother's incompetence. The annual board meeting in April began like all the others. As Chief Operating Officer, I presented the results of the previous fiscal year, the best in the company's history: 22% revenue growth, a record-breaking 18.5% profit margin, and detailed plans for our first international expansion into Canada. The board members applauded enthusiastically. Even Ethan seemed appropriately impressed, though he was probably more focused on the charity golf luncheon he'd be attending after the meeting. Everything seemed normal until my father, Howard Blackwell, now 78 years old, unexpectedly stood up. In recent years, he had rarely participated actively in meetings, preferring a more ceremonial role while I handled the actual business operations. "I have an important announcement," he began, his voice still surprisingly strong for his age. "After 5 decades leading this company, I have decided it's time for a full leadership transition." A murmur spread through the room. My heart involuntarily sped up. After 30 years of building this company, could it finally be? It is with great pride that I announce my son, Ethan Blackwell, as the next president and CEO of Blackwell Enterprises. Shock rippled through the room like an electric current. Martin, our CFO, looked at me with wide eyes. Jennifer dropped her pen. Sylvia Crawford, the longest-serving board member after my father, frowned in visible confusion. Only Ethan smiled, not looking the least bit surprised. Audrey will, of course, continue in her vital role as Chief Operating Officer, my father added, as if offering me a consolation prize after 3 decades of relentless work. Her operational expertise, combined with Ethan's leadership vision, will make for an unbeatable team. Leadership vision? The same man who, just last year, suggested we invest in a chain of golf-themed restaurants? Who arrived at the office at 11 a.m. and left at 3 p.m. for his business lunches? Who required my intervention to reverse 3 disastrous decisions in just the past 2 years? I felt heat rising up my neck, a fury threatening to erupt after decades of being contained. But years of self-control in boardrooms dominated by men had taught me to keep a composed expression even in the most provoking moments. "Any questions?" my father concluded, looking directly at me, daring me to challenge his decision publicly. The silence in the room was palpable. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my reaction. I took a deep breath, fully aware that my response would shape not just this moment, but potentially the future of the company I had dedicated my life to building. "When will this transition be effective?" I asked with a calmness that even surprised me. "Immediately," Howard responded, almost seeming disappointed by my controlled reaction. "The press release will go out this afternoon." After the meeting, I walked into my office and shut the door. The partial view of the Willamette River from my window suddenly felt irrelevant. 30 years of sacrifice, innovation, and unrecognized leadership had culminated in this definitive rejection. Vanessa appeared minutes later without knocking, her face already red with indignation. "This is ridiculous, Audrey. You built this company. Without you, we'd be selling couches in 3 corner stores." "It's his company," I replied mechanically, still processing what had just happened. "No," Vanessa corrected, shutting the door behind her. "It's the company you built. Every brick, every contract, every dollar of profit has your work behind it." It was then that Ethan walked in without knocking, his face displaying that condescending smile he had perfected over a lifetime of undeserved privilege. "Little sister, I hope there are no hard feelings. You know how traditional Dad is. He always wanted a man leading the family business." His falsely conciliatory tone made my stomach tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'll need your help." "Of course," Ethan continued, settling into the chair across from my desk as if he were already prepared to delegate his new responsibilities. "You have that knowledge of operational details. I handle the vision, you handle the execution. It's always worked for us, hasn't it?" I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw not just the spoiled boy who had grown up in the shadow of my work, but the man who would never truly understand what I had built. Not due to a lack of intelligence, but a lack of passion, commitment, and respect for the business he was now inheriting. "Congratulations, Ethan," I said simply. "I'm sure you'll bring your own perspective to the company." My measured response seemed to disappoint him. He had expected tears, protests, perhaps even an indignant resignation that would give him even more control. Instead, he found the same Audrey as always, composed, professional, impenetrable. When he left, Vanessa looked like she was ready to commit a crime. "How can you accept this so calmly, after everything you've sacrificed?" I looked at her with a faint smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Who said I'm accepting it?" Deep inside my locked drawer, beneath folders of quarterly reports and strategic plans, lay a discreet red folder marked simply as Project Phoenix, documents that had remained untouched for 15 years, since the Great Recession that had nearly destroyed everything. Perhaps finally, it was time for the Phoenix to rise from the ashes. That night, in my downtown Portland apartment, I called a small meeting, just the 3 people I trusted completely. Vanessa Hartley, my longtime attorney, Martin Chen, our meticulous chief financial officer, and Jennifer Miles, the young executive I had personally mentored over the past few years. My apartment was functional and elegant, reflecting my personality, well-planned spaces, carefully selected contemporary art, and stunning views of the city that had watched me build an empire. Unlike Ethan's ostentatious mansion in the suburbs, my home was a sanctuary of practicality and good taste. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," I said, pouring aged whiskey into crystal glasses for each of them. Even Jennifer, who usually refused alcohol, accepted. Something stronger than water seemed fitting for the solemn atmosphere. "After what happened today, we're all on your side, Audrey," Martin stated, his lightly accented voice becoming more pronounced when he was emotional. "What happened was unfair isn't a strong enough word." "It was an insult," Vanessa declared bluntly. "Not just to you, but to the intelligence of everyone who knows the real story behind Blackwell." Jennifer remained silent, watching me closely. Of everyone in the room, she was the one most like me, analytical, observing before speaking, always calculating several steps ahead. "There's something you don't know," I began, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "Something I've kept secret for 15 years. I walked over to what appeared to be a decorative painting on the opposite wall, an abstract landscape in shades of red and gold. Removing it, I revealed a small built-in safe. Entering the combination, I opened it and pulled out a red folder marked simply as Project Phoenix. The tension in the room was palpable as I returned to the coffee table. I opened the folder and distributed its contents, legal documents which I handed to Vanessa, followed by complex financial spreadsheets for Martin, and finally detailed organizational diagrams for Jennifer. During the 2008 recession, when we were on the brink of bankruptcy, Howard was willing to sell the company for pennies on the dollar to the Montgomery Group. I began, the memory still tightening my chest even after so many years. They offered us less than a third of the actual value of our assets, but my father was panicking. The economy was in free fall, our loans had been called in, and he saw only one way out. I remember the Montgomery offer, Martin murmured, but I thought you convinced Howard to turn it down. Officially, yes, I confirmed. But the truth is, he was determined to sell. Ethan supported the sale. He was already planning what kind of yacht he'd buy with his share. To them, Blackwell was just an asset to be liquidated when convenient. I took a sip of whiskey, letting the warmth spread before continuing. Instead of allowing decades of work to be destroyed, I took extreme measures. You all remember that at Nichio, the time we restructured our corporate architecture, supposedly to facilitate regional financing and optimize taxes. Vanessa nodded slowly, already reviewing the documents with growing astonishment. I created a parallel corporate structure, I explained. Every time we expanded into a new region, we established a new LLC for local operations. What no one noticed, not even you, Vanessa, was that I structured these LLCs so that 51% of the shares were owned by a separate holding company, Phoenix Holdings. Vanessa's eyes widened as she reached the critical page in the documents. Wait, you own Phoenix Holdings? Yes, I confirmed, sole shareholder and CEO. And Phoenix Holdings is the majority owner of all operations that generate 83% of our annual revenue, Martin added, already analyzing the figures with his characteristic precision. Blackwell Enterprises Inc. is essentially a management company. And a brand name? Exactly, I confirmed, watching as understanding dawned on the three of them. Jennifer, always sharp, was the first to articulate the full implication. That means Ethan may be the CEO of Blackwell Enterprises, but you control the assets that create value. If you wanted to, you could separate all these operations from the main company and leave him with practically nothing. A heavy silence filled the room as everyone processed the scope of what I had just revealed. This wasn't just a contingency plan. It was a complete, secret restructuring of the company that I had ingeniously built and maintained for 15 years. How did you pull this off? Vanessa finally asked, the lawyer in her clearly impressed by the legal maneuver. How did no one notice? Each LLC was created legitimately, with all the proper documentation, I explained. Phoenix Holdings was registered in Delaware using a separate law firm. When we needed Howard's signatures, I slipped the documents into piles of routine administrative paperwork. He signed without reading the details. He trusted that I was simply handling the fine print. Martin shook his head, impressed. This is brilliant and terrifying at the same time. Why didn't you ever tell us? Vanessa asked, a note of hurt in her voice. I thought you trusted us. I looked at my oldest friend, understanding her pain. Protection, I answered honestly. If something went wrong, I wanted you all to be able to truthfully say you didn't. And no, and frankly, I never thought I'd have to use this. I always believed my father would eventually recognize everything I built. What a naive thought, I added with a bitter smile. Jennifer, who had remained silent while digesting the information, finally spoke. What's the plan now? That was the critical question. After decades of building Blackwell Enterprises, I had secretly created the tools to potentially dismantle it. The irony wasn't lost on me. First, we need to make sure everything is legally airtight, I replied, slipping into the strategic mode that had always been my natural state. Vanessa, review all the contracts. I want 3 independent law firms confirming that the structure is untouchable. I turned to the CFO. Martin, We need a full valuation of these separate operations. How much is Phoenix Holdings worth versus Blackwell Enterprises' corporate shell? And Jennifer, I continued, prepare dossiers on all regional executives. We need to know who will stand with us if this turns into an open battle. Map out loyalties, vulnerabilities, priorities. And your father and brother? Martin asked cautiously, the concern evident in his eyes. I took another sip of whiskey, considering the question. Despite the anger I felt, I hadn't ignored the emotional complexities involved. Howard Blackwell was more than just my boss. He was my father. Ethan, despite everything, was my brother. They were family no matter how dysfunctional we were. Let them enjoy the party for now, I finally responded. The more Ethan acts like a CEO, the more rope I have to. Well, you get the idea. So the plan isn't to act immediately? Jennifer asked, always seeking clarity. No, I confirmed. The plan is to fully prepare while we observe. If Ethan surprises everyone and actually proves himself competent, well, maybe I'll just keep Phoenix as a safety net and continue as always, behind the scenes. I paused, allowing realism to set in. But knowing my brother, he will inevitably make decisions that threaten everything we've built. When that moment comes, and it will come, we'll be ready. The plan was in motion. Over the next 2 weeks, I maintained a facade of acceptance while Ethan implemented his first big ideas as CEO, just as predicted. First came the redesigned corporate uniforms at an astronomical cost. We need a more modern, more dynamic image, he declared during an executive meeting, unveiling sketches of blazers embroidered with the new Blackwell logo in gold thread. The budget for the project, $1.2 million. Next, the unnecessary renovation of the executive floor. How can we attract top talent without top-tier facilities? He argued, approving a full-scale remodel that included a high-tech conference room that would rarely be used and an exclusive executive gym. Estimated cost, $3.5 million, but what truly made Martin nearly choke during our secret weekly briefing was Ethan's disastrous attempt to renegotiate contracts with long-term suppliers. He insisted we could get better terms by being more aggressive. In negotiations, I reported, reading directly from the meeting notes. When our 15-year supplier in Asia explained that prices were already at the lowest possible point considering the quality we require, Ethan suggested they look elsewhere. Does he have any idea how long it took to build these supplier relationships? Martin asked in disbelief. The consistent quality of our products depends on these partnerships. Apparently not, I replied. And when I tried to intervene, I was reminded that strategic supply matters are now CEO decisions. Meanwhile, I quietly gathered documentation of every questionable decision Howard had made against my advice over the years, every failed project Ethan had led, and every occasion where I had been publicly discredited despite being right. Vanessa returned after 2 weeks with confirmations from 3 top law firms. Phoenix Holdings' structure was legally airtight. Martin completed his financial evaluation. The operations under Phoenix Holdings' control were worth approximately $2 billion, while the shell of Blackwell Enterprises, its trademarks, corporate structure, and assets not controlled by Phoenix, was worth about $800 million. Jennifer finalized her personnel analysis. Out of 26 key regional executives, 19 were unequivocally loyal to me. 4 would likely follow formal leadership regardless of who it was, and only 3 had personal ties to Ethan that might influence their decisions. The stage was set. Now, all we needed was the catalyst, the inevitable strategic mistake Ethan would make that would justify my intervention. Knowing my brother, I knew I wouldn't have to wait long. As I watched the sun set over Portland from my office that evening, I felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. There was no pleasure in preparing to potentially divide the company I had dedicated my life to building. But there was also no doubt in my mind. If necessary, I would do it, not for revenge, but to protect the legacy I had created through decades of relentless work. My moment would come not with loud vengeance, but with the undeniable and silent force of competence. The opportunity arose sooner than I expected. Just 3 weeks after his appointment as CEO, Ethan called an emergency board meeting to present what he called his grand strategic plan for Blackwell's future. The executive auditorium was filled not only with board members, but also with a selection of external consultants Ethan had hired. Young men in suits who reminded me of his fraternity friends, all wearing overly serious expressions and presenting impeccably polished PowerPoint slides that lacked any real substance. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Ethan began, flashing that smile business magazines loved to photograph. "After an in-depth analysis of market trends and strategic opportunities, I am ready to present the path that will take Blackwell Enterprises into its next phase of exponential growth." Seated in the front row beside Howard, I kept my expression carefully neutral. 3 decades of corporate meetings had taught me to mask my instinctive reactions. Martin and Jennifer, positioned strategically in separate areas of the room, cast me subtle glances of concern. Ethan's grand plan turned out exactly as I feared, a complete restructuring of the company, including the sale of our Northeast operations, a region I had carefully developed over 8 years and which now accounted for 22% of our total revenue. "The Northeast is oversaturated," Ethan declared, displaying carefully selected charts to support his thesis. "Competition is fierce, real estate costs keep rising, and our margin in the region has dropped to just 16.8%. I immediately noticed the manipulation in the numbers. That 16.8% margin was from the previous quarter, historically the weakest of the year for that region, and still above the industry average. With the capital generated from selling these operations," he continued enthusiastically, "we can fund the acquisition of Elite Sportsman Collection, a high-end sporting goods chain with a presence in premium markets where consumers have significant purchasing power." The murmurs spreading through the room revealed the board members' surprise. Elite Sportsman was known for its boutique stores selling golf, tennis, and other sports equipment primarily used by the economic elite, a market completely different from our traditional customer base. When the presentation ended, Howard glanced around the table with evident pride. "Audrey, I'm sure you have some comments on your brother's proposal." All eyes turned to me. This was the moment I had prepared for. I took a deep breath, mentally organizing my arguments before speaking. "The proposal presents some fundamental challenges," I began diplomatically. "It's a significant departure from our core strategy, which has consistently proven its value for over 2 decades. Ethan gave a condescending smile. "Sometimes we need the courage to break away from the past, little sister. We can't be stuck in old strategies in a rapidly evolving market." I ignored the implicit belittlement in little sister and continued, "With facts. Our customer base primarily consists of middle-class families who value affordable quality. Elite Sportsman serves an ultra-luxury market with completely different dynamics. It's an entirely different market," I reiterated, keeping my voice firm but professional. "Our customers are middle-class families, not buyers of $2,000 golf clubs." "We're stagnant, Audrey," Ethan replied with that condescension he had perfected over the years. "We need fresh blood, new markets. All the consultants agree." "What consultants?" I questioned, glancing at the suited young men he had brought in. "The ones I hired from the Ashton Group," Ethan answered, as if that alone settled any doubts. He conveniently failed to mention, of course, that the founder of Ashton Group was Derek Ashton, his former college roommate and weekly golf partner. Howard, seated at the head of the table, nodded in approval. "Audrey, your concerns are understandable, but you're stuck in the past. We need to modernize, as Ethan has been insisting." "Modernization doesn't mean abandoning the market we dominate to enter one we know nothing about," I replied, more firmly than I had intended. "Besides, our operations in the Northeast have been consistently profitable after years of investment in market development. But not as profitable as they could be," interrupted one of Ethan's consultants, a young man who looked like he had graduated from college the previous year. I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to remind him that I had built profitable operations before he was even born. I glanced around the table. The board was clearly divided. Some of the older members seemed skeptical of Ethan's proposal, while others, particularly the newer ones, handpicked by my father, appeared inclined to support him. Sylvia Crawford, the longest-serving board member besides my father, was watching me intently. At 75, Sylvia was a force to be reckoned with. the widow of one of my father's earliest business partners, and a woman who had navigated the corporate world when few could. Over the years, she had become a quiet ally, one of the few people who consistently recognized my contributions. Before we vote, I said calmly, making a decision that would change everything, I'd like to present some relevant information. I gave a subtle nod to Jennifer, who discreetly stood up and began distributing folders to each board member. As she did, I noticed Ethan's expression shift, from confidence to confusion, and finally to irritation. "What is this?" Howard asked, clearly displeased by the unplanned disruption. "The first page is an explanation of Blackwell Enterprises. Actual corporate structure," I explained, keeping my voice steady and professional. "As you can see, 83% of our revenue comes from operations that are primarily controlled by Phoenix Holdings." Ethan laughed, that hollow, forced laugh he used when he felt threatened. "What kind of nonsense is this? I've never even heard of Phoenix Holdings." "The second page," I continued, ignoring him, "is the list of directors of Phoenix Holdings. There's only one name, mine." Howard's expression shifted quickly, from irritation to confusion, and then to profound shock as he grasped the implications. He flipped through the documents frantically, as if searching for some mistake, some alternative explanation. "This can't be legal," Ethan protested, his confidence visibly crumbling. "Dad, she's bluffing. She has to be." "The third page," I continued with the same methodical calm, "contains the opinion of 3 independent law firms confirming the complete legality of this arrangement, which was established 15 years ago to protect the company's assets during the 2008 recession." A heavy silence filled the room. Even the consultants hired by Ethan looked uncomfortable, clearly realizing they had been caught in the middle of a family and corporate drama they were not prepared for. Sylvia Crawford was the first to speak, after the initial shock, her voice carrying decades of business experience. "Audrey, what exactly are you telling the board today?" I looked directly at her, respecting her bluntness with equal honesty. "I'm saying, Ms. Crawford, that if the board approves this reckless plan, I will exercise my rights as the majority controller of core operations and separate these entities from Blackwell Enterprises. Ethan may be the CEO, but he will be the CEO of an empty office." Howard slammed his hand on the table with surprising force for a man his age. His usually composed face was now red with anger. "How could you do this behind my back? This is my company." I met my father's gaze, refusing to back down. Decades of repressed emotions, frustration, hurt, disappointment, threatened to surface, but I kept my voice steady. "No, Dad," I responded, calmly. "It was your company, a small corner shop with 3 employees. The empire it is today? I built it. Every expansion, every acquisition, every turnaround during crises, that was me on the front lines, not Ethan, and often against your own overly cautious advice." I turned to my brother, who looked as if he had been hit by a truck, his previous arrogance replaced by a mixture of shock and fear. "You may be the son, Ethan, but you never cared enough about this business to understand how it actually works." Ethan, partially recovered, shifting from stunned to defensive. This is some kind of corporate coup. It's manipulation. It's business, Ethan," I interrupted, using the same condescending tone he had always used with me. "Something you should have learned before trying to sell off a quarter of our operations to buy golf stores." One of the younger board members, clearly confused, hesitantly raised a hand. "Sorry, but what exactly does this mean in practical terms? Can Ms. Blackwell actually—" "Yes, she can," Vanessa interjected, speaking for the first time. As the company's attorney for 15 years, her word carried significant weight. "The structure is legally sound. The regional operating entities are indeed controlled by Phoenix Holdings, which in turn is entirely controlled by Audrey Blackwell." Howard looked as if he had aged a decade in mere minutes. His shoulders, usually held high with patriarchal pride, now slumped under the weight of the revelation. "You planned this from the beginning? All this time?" "No," I answered honestly. "I created Phoenix Holdings during the recession because you and Ethan were willing to sell everything we built for a fraction of its value. It was a safeguard, a way to protect our legacy from impulsive decisions that would have destroyed it. I looked around the table at the board members' stunned faces. I never planned to use it. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that one day my work would be recognized, that leadership would be passed down based on merit, not gender or family tradition. Sylvia. Crawford, always the voice of pragmatic wisdom, leaned forward. What do you want, Audrey? Clearly, you didn't come prepared just to block Ethan's proposal. It was the question that mattered, the one that cut through the family drama and reached the heart of the issue. What did I truly want after decades of quietly building an empire from behind the scenes? A fair vote, I answered, looking directly at Howard. The board will choose between my leadership and Ethan's based on merit and results, not gender or family tradition. If Ethan wins legitimately, I will respect the decision and work with him. If I win, I will be the CEO this company deserves after decades of building it. Howard looked completely defeated. You've cornered us. No, Dad, I corrected, feeling a strange mix of sadness and resolve. I simply created contingencies to protect what I built because I knew, deep down, that this day would come. You would never see a woman as a legitimate leader, no matter how much success I brought. The words hung in the air, decades of unspoken truth finally laid bare. Howard didn't respond, but his silence was confirmation enough. I propose that the board adjourn for an executive session, Sylvia suggested, ever the pragmatist. We need to discuss this without the current administration present. As I stood to leave, I noticed the expressions around the table, shock, confusion, and on some faces, a reluctant respect I had never seen directed at me before. Ethan looked completely stunned, as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. Howard kept his eyes down, avoiding my gaze. Out in the hallway, Jennifer approached. You were incredible in there, she whispered. Calculated, but powerful. I don't feel any triumph, I admitted, the initial adrenaline starting to fade. I never wanted it to be like this. I know, she replied gently. That's why you deserve to lead. Because for you, the company was never about power or status. It was about building something meaningful. As we waited, Ethan stormed past us toward the men's restroom, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. Part of me wanted to call out to him to try to explain, not just that this wasn't personal, but that he could still have an important role if he only accepted his true capabilities instead of the ones Howard had projected onto him. But I knew this wasn't the time. Some conversations would have to wait until the dust settled. An hour later, we were called back in. The air in the boardroom felt different, more solemn, more resolute. I immediately noticed that Howard had moved from his seat at the head of the table. In his place sat Sylvia Crawford, now seemingly leading the meeting. The board has reached its decision, Sylvia announced, her voice carrying the authority of decades of business experience. After careful consideration, we have unanimously voted, with the exception of Mr. Howard Blackwell, who abstained, to appoint Audrey Blackwell as CEO of Blackwell Enterprises, effective immediately. The silence that followed was almost tangible. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Validation, relief, but also a strange sense of emptiness. The battle I had secretly prepared for over the years had ended with a formal recognition that, while deserved, came decades too late. There's more, Sylvia continued. The board strongly recommends that the Phoenix Holdings structure be reintegrated into Blackwell Enterprises within a reasonable time frame to ensure corporate integrity and transparency for shareholders. I nodded in agreement. I had never intended to keep the dual structure permanently. It was a safeguard, not an end goal. As for Ethan Blackwell, Sylvia went on, looking directly at my brother, the board suggests creating a role better suited to his capabilities, to be determined by the new CEO. To everyone's surprise, especially mine, Ethan finally spoke. His voice, stripped of its usual arrogance, sounded almost reflective. I don't want a role given out of pity, he said, avoiding my gaze. I've always known, deep down, that I didn't have what it takes to lead this company. I just never had the courage to admit it to myself, or to our father. Howard, suddenly looking fragile in his new seat, now distant from the head of the table, said nothing. His expression was indescribable, a mix of resignation, disappointment, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of long overdue recognition. When the meeting ended, I asked everyone to leave except for my father and brother. The silence between the three of us was thick with decades of unmet expectations, unacknowledged contributions, and unspoken truths. It was time for the hardest and perhaps most important conversation we had ever had as a family. When the last board member shut the door behind them, it was just the three of us in the room, Howard, Ethan, and me, a fractured family at the epicenter of a corporate empire. The silence between us was heavy, laden with years of words left unsaid. The clock on the wall seemed to mark each second with deliberate slowness, as if even time itself recognized the gravity of this moment. "You both always took my dedication for granted," I finally said, choosing my words carefully. "Never as the strength it truly was. Dad, you planted the seed, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I turned that seed into a forest, and I deserve to be recognized for it." Howard, now looking far older than his 78 years, kept his eyes fixed on the polished mahogany table. When he finally looked up, there was a vulnerability in his eyes that I had never seen before. I never imagined that you—" He paused, his words failing him. "That I was capable of this?" I finished for him. "Or determined enough. That's always been our fundamental difference. You saw me as your little girl, not as the executive you had been training my entire life." "It wasn't just that," Howard finally admitted, his voice weaker than I had ever heard it. "It was the fear that you would be better than me." The confession hung in the air, surprising in its honesty. In my entire life, I had never heard Howard Blackwell admit to weakness or insecurity, especially not in relation to me. "And you are better," he continued, now looking directly at me. "What you've built, it surpasses anything I ever dreamed of for Blackwell. But admitting that would mean accepting that my vision was limited, that my daughter surpassed me in every way." "Shouldn't that be a source of pride?" I asked, more softly than I intended. "Seeing the next generation go beyond what you imagined?" Howard gave a sad smile. "It should be. For a better man it would have been." Ethan, who had remained unusually silent, was the next to speak. To my surprise, he didn't have the defensive tone I had expected, but instead a calm introspection I had never associated with my impulsive younger brother. "You were right, Audrey," he said, lifting his eyes to meet mine. "I never really understood the business like you did. I never cared enough to learn its complexities. And yet you still felt entitled to lead it," I responded, not with anger, but with the accumulated sadness of years spent watching his indifference toward what I valued most. "Because it was expected," he admitted, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture that reminded me of our father decades ago. "The son takes over the father's business. I never questioned that assumption, even though I always knew deep down that you were more qualified." Ethan stood, walking toward the window that offered a panoramic view of Portland, the city where it all began with a small furniture store. "You know what's really ironic? I always envied your freedom." "Freedom?" I repeated, confused. "What freedom? I've spent every moment of the last 30 years working tirelessly for this company." "Yes, but because you chose to," he replied, turning to face me. "You built something because you truly wanted to build it. I spent my entire life filling a role that Dad assigned to me before I even knew who I was or what I wanted." That perspective caught me off guard. I had never considered that Ethan's privileged position as the apparent heir might have been, in its own way, just as restrictive a prison as my forced invisibility had been for me. "What do you really want, Ethan?" I asked, realizing that I might have never truly asked him that before. Not genuinely, without judgment. He seemed momentarily surprised by the question, as if he too had just realized that no one had ever really asked him that before. "I've always been good with people," he answered after a moment of reflection. "Not with spreadsheets or long-term strategies, but with relationships. Building bridges, maintaining connections. It was true. Despite all his shortcomings as an executive, Ethan had always had an undeniable talent for making people feel valued, for remembering personal details, and for cultivating relationships that often proved valuable to the company. Howard finally found his voice again. "I made a mistake, Audrey. A mistake based on biases I didn't even realize I had. You are the Blackwell who should lead Blackwell Enterprises. You always were." His words, so simple, yet so profoundly significant, made something inside me crack. A knot I had carried for decades. The constant weight of being unrecognized, underestimated, marginalized, began to loosen. "And as for me," Ethan added, "I think it's time to find my own path, not the one that was predetermined." "No," I replied, surprising all three of us. "Blackwell Enterprises still needs you, Ethan, just not as CEO." In the following weeks, we implemented a real leadership transition, one that reflected a new vision for the company, one that recognized the genuine talents of each person and placed them where they could truly shine. Howard announced his full retirement, assuming the title of Founder Emeritus, a position of honor that acknowledged his contributions without granting operational authority. To my surprise, he seemed relieved, as if the burden of maintaining a facade of control had finally been lifted. "I should have done this 10 years ago," he admitted during a private dinner. "I could have enjoyed more of life instead of clinging to a role I had long outgrown." For Ethan, we created a position that finally leveraged his true strengths. Director of Strategic Relations, overseeing corporate partnerships, VIP client relations, and social responsibility initiatives. For the first time since I had known him, my brother seemed genuinely energized by his work, not trying to imitate my skills or live under the shadow of our father's expectations, but cultivating his own garden within the family empire. "I always thought success meant being you or dad," he remarked during one of our now frequent weekly lunches. "I never considered that it could mean being the best version of myself." Jennifer Miles was promoted to President of Operations, the position I held for so long, becoming the youngest executive at that level in the company's history. Martin remained CFO, his meticulous attention to detail now more valued than ever, and Vanessa ascended to the position of General Counsel. My first formal action as CEO was to call a meeting with all employees, not just virtually for the 230 stores, but in person, traveling to each of the 7 regions over 2 intense weeks. I wanted everyone to understand that a new era had begun, one not based on family tradition or undeserved privilege, but on the recognition of talent, hard work, and shared vision. "Some of you have known me for decades," I said at each meeting. "Others only know my name from operational memos. But all of you are part of what we have built together, and my door will always be open to your ideas, concerns, and aspirations." As for Phoenix Holdings, as promised to the board, I initiated the process of reintegrating it into Blackwell Enterprises' corporate structure. However, it wasn't a simple dissolution. I turned the experience into an opportunity to establish new principles of corporate governance. Phoenix Holdings was created to protect our company from decisions based on anything other than merit and sound business judgment, I explained during a special shareholder meeting. By reintegrating it, we are instituting permanent safeguards that will ensure that merit, not family ties or gender, determines the future leadership of Blackwell Enterprises. Among these safeguards was a new corporate bylaw requiring all candidates for senior leadership positions to have proven experience in the company's operations, not just empty titles or family connections. 6 months later, I invited my father to dinner at my house, something we rarely did. I prepared his favorite meal, prime rib with baked potatoes and asparagus, and opened a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon I had been saving for a special occasion. The conversation flowed more easily than I had expected. Howard, freed from the burden of leadership, seemed more relaxed, more reflective. We talked about the early days of the store, about my mother, a topic we rarely touched on, and about the future of the company under my leadership. "Third quarter numbers are impressive," he commented as we drank coffee after the meal. "An 8% growth over the same period last year, even with the economy slowing down." "We're reaping the benefits of investments I made 3 years ago," I replied. "The new e-commerce platform is finally driving sales significantly." Howard nodded, contemplative. "Why did you never tell me about Phoenix?" he suddenly asked, the question that had clearly been on his mind throughout dinner. I considered the question before answering. "Because you would have tried to stop me, and then we would have lost everything in the recession." He thought about that for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right, I would have. I've always been risk-averse, while you had the vision I never did. I learned to be cautious because of you, Dad. I learned to be visionary despite you." Instead of taking offense, Howard smiled with a resigned sadness. "Do you know what your mother told me before she passed away? Howard, you're so busy looking for an heir that you don't see the queen right in front of you." It took me almost 30 years to understand what she meant. The mention of my mother, and her insight that endured even decades after her death, brought a knot to my throat. "She always saw something in me that you couldn't," I replied softly. "She saw you clearly," Howard agreed. "I was too busy looking for a reflection of myself." We fell silent for a moment, letting the weight of these truths settle between us. "I built this empire from scratch, Dad. Not because I wanted to prove something to you, though maybe at first that was part of it. I did it because I knew I could. Because I saw possibilities where others only saw a small family business." Howard reached for my hand across the table, a gesture of affection rarely shown in our family. "And now everyone can see what you've built, Audrey, including me." A year had passed since that board meeting that changed everything. Blackwell Enterprises hadn't just survived the transition, it had thrived. Our first true international expansion into Canada was exceeding all projections. The new line of environmentally sustainable products I had implemented, something Howard had always deemed too risky, was attracting a younger generation of consumers. Ethan had flourished in his new role, using his natural charisma and social connections to forge valuable partnerships. To my surprise, he had become one of the most passionate advocates for our corporate sustainability initiatives. "Who would have thought I'd become the family hippie?" he joked during an executive meeting while presenting his proposal for a training program that offered career opportunities to young people from underserved communities. Jennifer Miles was exceeding all expectations as president of operations, bringing an innovative perspective that complemented my more traditional approach. Sometimes, watching her lead meetings with the same focused intensity I had at her age, I felt a strange mix of maternal pride and professional satisfaction. One quiet afternoon, while working in my office, I received an unexpected visit from Sylvia Crawford. At 76, she still carried the same impeccable posture and piercing gaze that had defined her when I met her decades ago. "This chair suits you," she remarked, observing me from behind the CEO's desk. "I always knew you'd be sitting there one day." "You were one of the few," I replied with a smile. "Thank you for your support over the years, Sylvia." She waved off my gratitude with a gesture. "I didn't support you because you were a woman, Audrey. I supported you because you were the right person for the job. You always were." As we talked about the company's future, about eventual succession plans, now based on merit, not DNA, and about the legacy we hope to leave behind, I realized I had achieved something many executives never do: the peace of knowing that the company I built would remain strong even after my eventual departure. From the window of my office, now the former CEO's office, with a full view of the city that housed the headquarters of the country's largest furniture and home decor retail chain, I could see Portland stretching out to the horizon. Somewhere, in that urban landscape, was the site of the small corner store where it all began, where a 16-year-old girl once cleaned display windows while dreaming of an empire. That store no longer existed. It had been turned into a restaurant years ago. But its legacy lived on in each of the 230 Blackwell stores spread across the country, in each of the 3,500 employees who depended on the vision I had turned into reality. Some people spend their lives trying to prove their worth to others, I reflected as I watched the city lights begin to glow against the evening sky. I learned that true power comes from recognizing your own worth, even when others fail to see it. My secret hadn't just been a clever corporate structure. It had been the quiet confidence that one day, the truth would come to light. And the truth, as everyone had finally come to recognize, was that I hadn't just built an empire from nothing. I had become the queen my mother always knew I would be.